From vaudeville to the silver screen to the small screen, the Marx Brothers made an impact wherever people found them. Now, Tom Fox and Mike Volkov bring them into the boardroom to help explain and explore the sometimes chaotic world of governance, risk management, ethics, and compliance. This is Why a Duck? Into the Compliance Soup, which is part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of Why a Duck? Over the next 3 podcasts, Mike and I are going to take a look at some of the highlights in FCPA enforcement from 2019 in the context of the great Marx Brothers movie, A Night at the Opera. In this episode, we introduce the movie and talk about why it is on the AFI Top 100 Movies of All Time. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Mike Volkov for another episode of Why a Duck? We're going to do a 3-part series where we take a look back at enforcement actions and issues from 2019, then put on our Karnak the Magnificent pontification hats and look forward into 2020. We're going to do so within the context of discussing one of our joint favorite Marx Brothers movies, although they're all our favorites, A Night at the Opera. So, Mike, first of all, welcome.
Well, thanks, Tom. Happy New Year to you, and looking forward to a great year, 2020.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a time to take a deep dive into the background of A Night at the Opera. It's a 1935 comedy starring the Marx Brothers and a host of others, most notably Kitty Carlisle and Margaret Drummond. It was the first of 5 films the Marx Brothers made for MGM after they left Paramount, and the first after Zeppo left the act. The film was adapted by George Kaufman and Maury Riskin from a story by James McGinnis. It was directed by Sam Wood. It was a smash at the box office. It was selected for preservation by the National Film Registry, by the Library of Congress. It's also on the top 100 of AFI movies of all time. It really led or began a new era for the Marx Brothers comedy. I'm a big fan of the Paramount era because that was just complete anarchy and zaniness. But MGM had a different format, and MGM really wanted to have something resembling a plot and calculation. Irving Thalberg, the producer, the wunderkind producer at MGM, insisted on strong story structure to make the Marx Brothers more sympathetic by having a firm and identified villain that was the target of their mischief. Thalberg's logic was the Marx Brothers would get twice the box office with half the laughs. Interestingly, Groucho agreed with this approach and said in a later interview later in his life, of the 13 Marx Brothers films, 2 were far above average. Some were pretty good, some were deplorable, but he thought the best 2 were made by Thalberg, A Night at the Opera, and A Day at the Races. The Night at the Opera, each of the brothers' characters was refined. Groucho was somewhat less nonsensical and less troublemaking. Chico became less of a scammer and gained some intelligence. That's in quotes. Harpo became less mischievous and more sympathetic. The films generally dived directly into a plot and then had a clear beginning, middle, and end. There was always a grand finale in the traditional method of MGM musicals, and these were, as all MGM musicals were, in the 30s and 40s, spectacular. There was generally a friendship between a romantic couple and Chico. There was extensive verbal routines that we're going to go over in some of the subsequent podcasts. Chico and Harpo were always partners and sometimes brothers. Imagine that. There was lush, and I mean lush surroundings as backdrops. There were some key scenes with all Marx Brothers. There was always a fall from grace and a rebound. So it was a different kind of movie. Mike, I don't know what your thoughts might have been. As I said, I really like the zaniness and anarchy of Paramount, but their comedy was so great it worked with switching over to MGM. What are some of your thoughts on A Night at the Opera?
Well, it's among the Marx Brothers fans, there's always a debate as to whether or not it was the best movie they ever made. And I agree with you. I like the zaniness of the Paramount days. But on the other hand, this worked just as well, too. One interesting bit of trivia, my father was on To Tell the Truth, the show, and this shows our age, and the only person who guessed him of the judges was Kitty Carlisle. And so my father made $60 and 3 wrong guesses on To Tell the Truth. And Kitty Carlisle has always been a favorite of mine. And I thought she was terrific in this. But, the funny thing is when you'd go see these movies in a movie theater, people wanted to just see the zaniness. And when the singing would start, people would hiss and boo, boo, bring back the Marx Brothers. But I thought these were great stories. There's some incredible lines and scenes in this. And Day at the Races, I think, is, one of my favorites as well. So it's just also we lose Zeppo. I mean, we never see Zeppo again. So when they moved to MGM. One last story, and I think I mentioned this in an earlier podcast, but I'll mention it again, was there's a great interview on YouTube of Groucho by Dick Cavett. And in that, he tells the story of how they wanted to have a meeting with Irving Thalberg, and they could never get a meeting with him. So the Marx Brothers showed up once, just went into his office, started burning his books in the fireplace that Thalberg had in his office, and took off all their clothes and sat naked and waited for Thalberg to show up. Needless to say, Groucho says they had the meeting when Thalberg showed up. But in any event, it's a great movie, and it's one of my favorites. And I look forward to talking about some of the best scenes coming up.
What caused your father to be on What's My Line, Mike?
Because his life was pretty amazing. He defected from the Soviet Union, was in a plane crash in Eastern Europe in which everybody died except for him, and he snuck his way into the United States as a defector, and then became an editor at Newsweek magazine, writing against the Soviet Union and sort of that type of thing. So it was kind of a pretty cool story, and so he got a lot of publicity. He used to make speeches and go around the college circuit and stuff. It was interesting.
So, Mike, you wrote a couple of, I thought, just fabulous blog posts, as all of your blog posts are, and you had a 3-part series. And today we're going to take up parts 1 and 2, where we take a look back. So we had a pretty stunning year in FCPA enforcement. What were some of the highlights for you?
Well, this was really an incredible year. I mean, if we were, Tom, 10 years ago, we were talking about these issues. If we had seen a year like this, this would have knocked our socks off. We had a record, not a record number of enforcement actions, but we had a record in terms of total penalties of over $2.6 billion. Obviously, that includes the Ericsson $1 billion settlement. But what a year. I mean, this is the biggest year that's happened since 2016, which was $2.4 billion. But the other thing I wanted to sort of point out was what I thought was really important is we're now seeing a maturation of enforcement. And by that, I mean, number one, SEC is taking on what I would call, quote unquote, some of the smaller cases, the under 100 million cases. DOJ is focusing more on the bigger cases and the criminal cases. And then more importantly, DOJ told us years ago that they were going to indict more people and bring cases against individuals. And what have they done? In the last 3 years, we've seen the rise from 17 indictments and guilty pleas in 1 year to 26 last year to 35 or 34 this year. And I'm forecasting for next year we're going to get into the 40s because you're going to see more cases like Cognizant Technology, where the company comes in, fully cooperates, gets a declination, and who gets left holding the bag? The CEO or the president and the general counsel, the senior people. So this is, to me, the model of where things are going. More individuals, more declinations, more enforcement of the corporate enforcement policy, more maturation in that. And the SEC taking on sort of the smaller cases. And I say smaller in quotes because it's obviously, it's still, in the tens of millions. But that's sort of what I see these days.
So, Mike, both on the individual and corporate front, I certainly agree that we had just some stunning enforcement actions this year. It's really interesting that you see this almost formal dichotomy of breaks between the SEC and the Department of Justice. I was going to explore that a little bit, but it really seems to me to be a great working relationship. As a former DOJ lawyer, would you see any of that as well?
Absolutely. And I think, I don't mean to suggest in any way that the SEC is not going to do big cases. It means the SEC is going to do big and, quote unquote, the small ones. What we used to see, I think, were like DOJ, let's look even 5 years ago, you'd see DOJ doing 20, 30, $40 million cases. Now, look, it's dominated now by cases like Fresenius, like Ericsson, like MTS Telesystems, in the hundreds of millions, even Walmart, in the $200 million range. And I think that shows that it's a smart use of resources when you think about it, Tom. In other words, we want to get, if our real belief is that deterrence comes from individual prosecution, that's what they're doing. And they told us they were going to do this, and they are really doing it. And I think that it also follows naturally with what we've talked about, how the corporate enforcement policy has become the framework within which all cases are now analyzed. And DOJ, I give them even more credit for sticking to the framework and applying it. We can always argue about whether or not the discount was appropriate or whether or not they really truly cooperated and how much of a discount they get or whether or not they got a declination. But to me, the framework is there. So for practitioners like me and you, we can advise clients on this issue with some greater sense of certainty as to what the upsides and downsides are. And that's what they've done. And I give them a lot of credit for that.
Mike, you mentioned a couple of cases that I thought were important, Cognizant Technologies and Fresenius. But we had two in the telecom space that were just stunning almost in terms of their overall scope of the fine and penalty based upon the overall scope of the bribery and corruption. That was MTS, which came in at $950 million, and Ericsson, which came in at $1 billion plus change. Does this, do you think, signals more scrutiny in the telecom industry, or would you say it's at the tail end of that scrutiny?
You raise a really interesting question but all the telecom cases, the big ones that we've seen, were related to Uzbekistan. And they were related to Uzbekistan because we had the notorious Gulnara Karimova, the daughter of the president who is since deceased, from Uzbekistan. But what is amazing to me is we had all these sort of Swedish, Nordic, Vimpelcom, Telia, MTS is a Russian company, and then Ericsson, a Swedish, equipment provider. I think it's really interesting that telecom is coming back in that sense. And here's the reason that I think we're going to see more telecom enforcement actions. Because as the world sort of updates their technology to 5G, all of these companies are in there bidding on potential upgrades to existing cell phone systems. And they all interact with the government officials because it's telecom and it's regulated. So I think that there's money out there, and you have the evil mix of money and government opportunities and government contracts. So I think we're going to see more in the telecom space. What's the difference between telecom and oil and gas? There's the same amount of sort of government interaction, and they're incredibly lucrative, particularly 5G contracts right now.
So, Mike, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode, but I hope everyone will join us again for our next podcast, where we take a look at some of the specific FCPA enforcement actions, some of the highlights, both from the DOJ and SEC, and we continue our discussion of A Night at the Opera, where Mike's going to talk us through perhaps the greatest Marx Brothers scene ever, at least in my opinion, the stateroom scene. Mike, thanks again, and I greatly look forward to continuing the conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. I hope you will join us for our next podcast, where we take a look at top enforcement actions from the DOJ and SEC from 2019 and talk about some of our favorite scenes from A Night at the Opera.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Why a Duck. Make sure to subscribe, and if you enjoyed the episode, leave a review.